Hello and welcome to the Learning to Be Human podcast. I am your host, Christopherlinkenbach, and this podcast is all about learning to navigate our emotions, learning to become truly human, learning how to just be in our bodies. Today's episode, we're going to be diving into depression. And this is a very familiar topic to myself, and one I get to explore with you firsthand, and then also kind of just interlude some facts here and there. But before we begin, let's start out with just a little quotation. Lately, I've been reading some of the work by Thomas More, Care of the Soul. It's one of his books, which I highly recommend. And in this book, one of his quotes is, "Depression is not a sign that you have gone wrong or that God is punishing you. It is simply a sign that you are sensitive to the complex interplay of soul and life in the world." So, with that, let's go ahead and start diving in. So first things first, just to give you a little personal background on depression. Depression is something that I've kind of danced with throughout my young adolescence and up into my early adulthood now. And it's really a peculiar experience. And I almost wanted to call it an emotion, but I don't really think that depression in itself is an emotion. In my experience of it, depression is more so a word we use to describe sort of a cluster of happenings inside of us. Gabor Mate, who is a medical doctor and a really amazing author on the subjects of trauma and understanding our own emotions, has discussed that depression is repressed anger, right? When an infant has a traumatic experience, such as an abuse or neglect, or something happens in which they want to lash out and become angry, but they don't have the capacity to do so, that anger gets welled up inside, and the disconnect between the mind and the body begins, and we no longer feel what's happening inside of us. That anger becomes too threatening to live, so we shut it down and we repress it or depress it. We hold that emotion down, when in reality we needed that anger to come out of us. Now, what's really interesting about depression is I don't think depression is an emotion either. It's really sort of interesting how we've sort of labeled depression as an emotion. I'm going to sneeze. Bless. Thank you. And because we've labeled depression an emotion, we've sort of blanketed what's really happening. Now, I'm currently going to grad school to become a therapist. And as I work with clients, practicing with people outside of school, where I'm able to just start practicing some of these therapeutic skills, what I'm beginning to realize is that depression is not an emotion. The further that I look into this, I begin to realize that depression is a word that was made up by clinicians, right? It's not part of the emotional experience. It's actually, if we went even deeper into it, it's been created so that we could create a pill for depression. We've created something which can then be treated. Now, what's interesting about that is that as soon as I start talking to somebody about depression and start asking what's going on, what do you mean by depression? They usually allude to a different sensation or different emotion. Typically what ends up happening is the depression is a sense of sadness, a sense of meaninglessness, a sense of hopeless, a sense of melancholy, of grief, of mourning. There are these deeper underlying emotions that are there, but they aren't accessible to the conscious mind. And when we use the word depression, we're kind of using this blanket statement over the top of them, which then creates sort of a disconnect between our body. Depression, we sort of have this strange idea of depression that it's this chemical imbalance in the brain that can be fixed through chemicals. And what Thomas More is talking about in his book, Care of the Soul, is that we don't need to fix depression, nor should we. because the depression is there as a result of something. The depression is there as a messenger of the body. If we're to think back into the history of our body, we all came from parents. We all had a mother and a father. And they had a mother and a father who had a mother and a father. And we continue that chain of ancestors back until we were animals, which we still are, until we were, more mammals without conscious egoic minds, further back, and then further back and further back until we were fish in the ocean, further back until we were just microbial beings. And that was roughly about 3.4 billion years ago. And since that point of 3.4 billion years ago, through our DNA strand, we've been passing information on from generation to generation about how the world works, how to survive in it. And essentially, we've been collecting wisdom. And we have access to that wisdom inside of our bodies. And our bodies are that wisdom. Our bodies are the wisdom of billions of years of evolutionary success. And when our egoic mind has the audacity to imagine that for a second it knows what is happening over the unconscious mind, it seems a little bit absurd because, as we know, it's kind of a known fact, about 95% of our mind is considered to be unconscious. And because of that, only about 5% of our mind is accessible to our conscious self. And that 5% thinks that it's the one running the show. But if you think about it, the conscious mind was developed after the body, right? It was developed after we were mammals, after we were fish. So what that means is that the unconscious and the conscious mind have had to learn to speak in different ways. And if you think about it, and really go deep into it, and this is sort of what Carl Jung was pointing to, is that at that level between conscious and unconscious, there's sort of this strange sort of communication that begins to happen because the unconscious mind cannot communicate in rational thinking thought like the conscious mind does. And so in order to communicate to the conscious mind, it has to do so in the way in which it has learned. So that could mean, for instance, using feelings, using images, using symbols, or even putting the conscious mind into situations so that it can learn or get the message across. And so if we start looking at depression from this lens, we can see that the depression is there as a result of the internal system trying to tell the conscious mind something. Something is missing here. Something is going wrong, right? A lot of depression kind of comes with this feeling of meaninglessness, of a lack of purpose, a lack of sense of place in the world and the universe, and perhaps an existential tone to it as well. And the depression becomes a messenger for a need to change. And if we can begin to look at our depression from this lens as opposed to the lens of trying to use a pill to get rid of it, then perhaps we can start working with it a little bit more and start seeing that that depression was needed, and not to push it away, but to start welcoming that depression. And one of the most common questions is, what do I do about my depression? And right there, that is the very paradox that has gotten us into depression in the first place, because it's not the doing. The doing is the mind trying to solve a problem of the mind, not realizing that the mind is the problem in the first place. When in reality, it's to just let go and take a break and to breathe, right? To connect with the body, connect with something inside. There's a message in there that's been cultivating, and it grows stronger and stronger and stronger until you can hear it. And so that's why it's so important to be in touch with the body and the messages that it's giving to us. And so we can begin to look at not what should I do about my depression, but how can I be with my depression? How can I learn from this? What is the message in here? And perhaps if we go deeper and deeper into that depression, we realize that there's actually some joy at the bottom of it. That perhaps it's been trying to pull us closer to what it is that we truly want. right? It's an expression of the soul in some way. But I've noticed that when I'm depressed, it could mean many things. And sometimes it is a simple adjustment of my nervous system. I notice that if I do breath work, which takes maybe 10-15 minutes, instantly my nervous system has calmed down. I've tuned in, I've listened. It's given me a chance to stop, to pause, to just breathe and be with my body. And maybe that's all my body needed in that moment. And maybe there's some deeper depressions that ask for a little bit more. But I've noticed that hot and cold therapy really helps as well to just kind of get some of that stuck energy moving a little bit. Exercising, cardio especially, has been a way to just like start releasing and working through some of that. And just taking a little bit of time to meditate as well. And just being with it and actually going into the feelings of it. It's all of these activities are getting me back into my body, are allowing me to feel what's going on inside of myself, because that's where the depression is coming from, is in my body, and I'm trying to run away from it. I'm trying to hide. I'm trying to do something else. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of a different sense of how we can start working with the depression and healing it, is to understand it and to be with it and to paint pictures of it and to draw it and to allow it to express itself, because there's a message in there. It's a part of you that is asking to be heard. And let's try and understand why it is there in the first place, as opposed to trying to just eliminating it and getting rid of it. Because that's what we've been doing as a culture for thousands of years, is trying to crave better emotions and trying to push something away. It's as if we've sort of labeled this normalcy on this idea of happiness being the state of normalcy or the epitome of life, that we're always supposed to be in this normal state, otherwise something is wrong. We're always supposed to be happy or else something is wrong or we failed, right? Whereas if we take the lens of life is going to be ups and downs and we can just ride that, then we can get a little bit more of a familiar sense of being in that. So with that, thank you so much for tuning in. If you need help with any of this, I am a coach and I have an ear to listen. And you can always schedule a free consultation in the link down below if you're really going through something. Perhaps we can help you find some meaning in your life. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and I'll catch you in the next one.